Picture this. You're a monk at Lindisfarne Monastery in the year 793 after Christ. It's early morning, and you're going about your daily prayers just like you have for years. The North Sea stretches out before you, that same empty, familiar horizon you've watched every single dawn of your adult life. Your monastery sits on this little island, connected to the mainland by a causeway that disappears at high tide. It's peaceful, it's predictable, it's safe. Then suddenly, out of absolutely nowhere, the sea explodes with 30 dragon-headed ships. Now, I want you to really think about this for a moment. These weren't just any ships appearing on the horizon. We're talking about vessels that seemed to materialize from thin air, longships that had somehow approached close enough to launch an immediate assault without anyone seeing them coming. The monks at Lindisfarne had been watching that same stretch of water for generations. They knew every current, every rock, every normal sight that ocean could produce. Yet somehow, these Vikings had achieved what should have been impossible. This wasn't just a raid. This was the announcement of a new kind of warfare, one where enemies could vanish and reappear like vengeful spirits, where the very concepts of safety and distance meant nothing anymore. The attack on Lindisfarne marked the beginning of an era when Vikings didn't just come to take your gold and run. They came like ghosts, struck like lightning, and disappeared back into nothingness before you could even comprehend what had happened to you. But here's the thing that really gets me about this story. This incredible ability didn't just happen overnight. The mastery of concealment that would terrorize medieval Europe for the next 3 centuries, it began decades earlier in the harsh fjords of Norway, born from a combination of desperate necessity and what can only be described as engineering genius. Let me take you back to those fjords, to a man named Thorstein the Bold. Now, Thorstein was facing what we might call an impossible equation. You've got these mountain walls. I'm talking about cliffs that rise straight up from the water like the walls of some giant's fortress. Inside these natural barriers, populations were growing, resources were becoming scarce, and everyone knew that the richest lands lay across dangerous, unpredictable seas. Traditional shipbuilding of the time? Forget about it. Those heavy, inflexible vessels that other European cultures were using might work fine for coastal trading, but they were about as useful for long-distance raiding as a stone hammer would be for surgery. Thorstein understood that if his people were going to survive, let alone thrive, they needed something completely revolutionary. And this is where Viking culture gets really fascinating, because Thorstein didn't just approach shipbuilding as a purely practical problem. Oh no, in Viking society, the creation of a longship was a sacred act that began in the forests, in groves that were considered holy ground. Priests would actually listen to trees, and I mean literally listen, to determine which oaks possessed the right spirit for shipbuilding. Think about the implications here. We're talking about a culture that believed the very soul of a tree could determine whether a ship would succeed or fail in battle. Each vessel began with rituals that connected the physical craft to spiritual forces. The oak had to be flexible enough to bend with massive waves rather than fight them, creating ships that could ride out storms that would destroy conventional vessels. But the real breakthrough, the innovation that would change everything, came from the construction technique itself. These ships were built to flex. Picture a giant wooden snake that could twist and bend with the motion of the sea rather than trying to muscle through it. The result was something that moved through water with an eerie, almost supernatural silence. Now, fast forward to 845 after Christ, and we meet Gunnar Stormey. This guy was originally a trader, someone who understood currents and weather patterns like most people understand their own backyard. But circumstances forced him into the raiding life, and that's when he made a discovery that would revolutionize Viking warfare forever. Gunnar was hiding from a Frankish patrol, CSAT, and let me tell you, if you were a Viking caught alone by Frankish soldiers, your life expectancy could be measured in minutes. He'd pulled his longship into a Danish marsh, basically using the reeds and shallow water as camouflage while he waited for the danger to pass. And that's when he noticed something extraordinary. The morning mist, combined with the shadows cast by the marsh reeds, made his dragon ship completely invisible from just 50 paces away. 50 paces! That's about half the length of a modern football field. A 30-foot longship, with a distinctive dragon head and striped sail, had somehow become invisible to the naked eye. Gunnar understood immediately that he wasn't just looking at a lucky accident, he was witnessing the birth of a completely new form of warfare. If Vikings could master this kind of concealment, they wouldn't just be raiders anymore. They would become something much more terrifying. They would become phantoms. The revelation sparked what can only be described as a revolution in military thinking. Vikings began treating concealment not just as a practical skill, but as a spiritual art form. They developed painting techniques using sacred symbols in colors that would blend with sea and sky. They created training regimens where entire crews learned to communicate through hand signals alone, allowing them to execute complex maneuvers in absolute silence. And here's what really sets this apart from anything else happening in medieval warfare. The Vikings understood that their shallow, draft ships, originally designed for river navigation, gave them access to hiding places that conventional vessels couldn't even reach. They could vanish into marshes, inlets, and coastal areas where pursuit was impossible. Picture the psychological impact on their enemies. One moment you're looking at empty water. The next moment, dragon ships are emerging from what you could have sworn was solid shoreline. It's like something out of a nightmare, except it's happening in broad daylight, and those aren't mythical creatures coming for you. They're very real warriors with very sharp weapons. By 860 after Christ, something unprecedented was happening across northern Europe. Viking fleets weren't just raiding anymore, they had become masters of what we might call tactical invisibility. The old rules of naval warfare, rules that had governed Mediterranean and European combat for centuries, were being rewritten by these northern ghost ships. And the most terrifying part? This was just the beginning. The techniques that allowed 30 ships to appear from nowhere at Lindisfarne were about to evolve into something far more sophisticated, far more deadly, and far more psychologically devastating than anyone could have imagined. By 860 after Christ, something absolutely extraordinary was happening across the waters of northern Europe. Viking fleets had evolved beyond simple raiders into something that defied the natural order itself. They had become phantoms. Now, I want you to understand what this transformation really meant. We're not talking about gradual improvement in existing tactics. This was a complete revolution in how naval warfare could be conducted. The Vikings had figured out how to make the impossible routine, and nowhere was this more dramatically demonstrated than in what became known as the Battle of the Hidden Fleet. Picture this scene: 30 Norse longships facing off against a superior Frankish naval force. In conventional warfare, the Vikings would be at a massive disadvantage. The Frankish ships were larger, more heavily armed, and significantly outnumbered the Norse vessels. By every military calculation of the time, this should have been a slaughter, with the Vikings on the losing end. But here's where it gets absolutely mind-bending. The Vikings didn't engage in conventional warfare at all. Instead, they spent 3 days, 3 entire days, disguised as coastal rocks. Think about the level of discipline and planning this required. We're talking about nearly 1,000 warriors sitting motionless in their ships, covered with seaweed, fishing nets, and specially woven coverings that completely broke up the distinctive silhouette of a longship. For 72 hours, these men held their positions while Frankish scouts passed close enough to literally touch their vessels, never suspecting that what they were looking at weren't natural rock formations. The psychological warfare aspect here is just staggering. The Frankish commanders had done their reconnaissance. They had surveyed the area. They had confirmed the coast was clear. In their minds, they were sailing through safe waters, probably discussing their next tactical moves, maybe even relaxing their guard because the intelligence was so certain. Then the rocks came alive. One moment, the Frankish fleet was moving through what they believed was empty water. The next moment, dragon heads were rising from stone, oars were appearing from nowhere, and they found themselves completely surrounded by enemies that had materialized from the landscape itself. The Frankish ships never had a chance to form battle lines, never had time to organize a response. They were destroyed by ghosts. This victory established what the Vikings called the shadow crews, theirs. And these weren't just elite warriors. These were men who had undergone training that went so far beyond normal combat skills that they might as well have been studying a completely different profession altogether. Let me paint you a picture of what shadow crew training actually involved. These warriors learned to read ocean currents by taste, not smell, taste. They could tell you which direction the current was flowing, how strong it was, and where it was headed just by putting seawater on their tongues. They navigated by watching the flight patterns of seabirds, understanding that different species would behave in predictable ways based on weather, season, and coastal geography. But it gets even more specialized. Shadow crew members could predict fog banks days in advance by reading subtle changes in water temperature, wind patterns, and atmospheric pressure. This wasn't mysticism. This was environmental science taken to an almost superhuman level of expertise. And the commitment to concealment went beyond just practical skills. These warriors bore distinctive tattoos, created with special inks, that actually helped them blend with shadows and darkness. We're talking about body modification specifically designed for camouflage purposes. Think about how sophisticated that concept is for the 9th century after Christ. Now, here's something that really challenges our modern assumptions about Viking society. Women played absolutely crucial roles in this stealth warfare system. While the men were learning to taste currents and read bird flights, Viking women were developing the technology that made concealment possible in the first place. They wove the intricate camouflage nets that could make a longship disappear against a rocky coastline. They performed the concealment rituals that warriors genuinely believed made ships invisible to enemy eyes. This wasn't just superstition. These rituals served real psychological purposes, building confidence and group cohesion that translated into better performance under pressure. The most skilled practitioners of these arts could allegedly achieve something that sounds like pure magic. They could make a longship disappear in open water using nothing but positioning and sail manipulation. Now, obviously we're dealing with optical illusions here, but think about the level of understanding of light, shadow, and perspective this would require. These people were applying principles of visual deception that wouldn't be formally studied by European scientists for centuries. The psychological impact of these phantom tactics multiplied Viking effectiveness in ways that went far beyond simple numerical advantages. Coastal settlements across Europe began living in a state of constant, nerve-wracking terror. You could look out at an empty horizon and never, ever be certain that safety was real. Churches started adding new prayers to their services. 1b. Specific prayers against what they called the invisible heathens. Think about that for a moment. The Christian Church, this massive institution that had been dealing with pagan threats for centuries, felt compelled to develop new theological responses to Viking stealth tactics. They were essentially admitting that conventional prayer wasn't adequate to deal with enemies who could appear and disappear at will. Some coastal communities made the ultimate decision. They abandoned their ancestral homes entirely, rather than live with the uncertainty. Entire settlements that had existed for generations simply packed up and moved inland, because the psychological pressure of never knowing when dragon ships might materialize from empty air had become unbearable. But the absolute pinnacle of phantom tactics came during the siege of Paris in 885 after Christ. This is where Viking stealth warfare reached its most sophisticated expression. Count Odo had done everything right from a defensive standpoint. Paris was protected by massive fortifications along the Seine River. The defences were designed by the best military engineers of the Frankish kingdom, and they should have been absolutely impregnable to naval assault. The river approaches were blocked, the walls were manned, and intelligence networks were watching for any sign of Viking approach. The Vikings bypassed all of it using camouflaged ships. Count Odo's own chronicles describe the absolute horror of seeing an empty Seine River suddenly fill with dragon ships, as if they had literally materialized from the water itself. The Vikings had managed to move an entire fleet past multiple layers of defenses without being detected once. They appeared behind fortifications that were supposed to protect the rear areas of the city, striking from directions that should have been impossible to approach. The defenders found themselves fighting enemies who were already inside their defensive perimeter before anyone realized an attack was even beginning. It was like discovering that your locked house was full of armed burglars who had somehow gotten inside without opening any doors or windows. By 870 after Christ, these phantom tactics had created something unprecedented in medieval warfare, DAR, an entire economy built on terror. A single stealth raid could extract more wealth than a conventional battle involving 10 times as many warriors, and with a fraction of the casualties. The shadow crews had developed intelligence networks that spanned the entire European coast. They knew the blind spots in every major defensive system. They tracked the movement patterns of merchant vessels, and they had detailed maps of every hidden approach to every significant target. Monasteries, these centers of learning and wealth that should have been protected by their sacred status, began paying tribute to ghosts. They would leave gold and silver at specific coastal locations, essentially buying protection from enemies they never saw but knew were watching. Imagine the psychological impact of that. You're paying ransom to invisible threats, never knowing if your tribute was actually accepted or if the phantom ships might appear anyway. The success of these tactics created a feedback loop that made the Viking threat exponentially more dangerous with each passing year. Success funded better ships, which enabled more ambitious raids, which brought greater wealth, which paid for technological improvements that enhanced concealment even further. Vikings were investing in new sail designs that reduced their ships' visible silhouettes. They developed hull treatments that eliminated the telltale sounds of wood creaking and water splashing. Some crews even experimented with primitive smoke screens using burning wet seaweed to create artificial fog banks for cover. The most successful phantom captains became wealthy enough to field multiple specialized vessels, creating what we might call wolf packs that could strike several targets simultaneously, while maintaining perfect coordination through their silent communication systems. And then there was Harold Greycloak, who took strategic invisibility to its absolute peak during his legendary summer campaign of 920 after Christ. Harold didn't just disappear and reappear. He turned psychological warfare into an art form that would make modern special forces operators nod with respect. His ghost fleet struck 3 separate kingdoms in succession, each time vanishing completely before any retaliation could be organized. But here's the truly brilliant part. Harold used decoy ships and false intelligence to make enemies defend against attacks that never came, exhausting their resources and destroying their morale through anticipation alone. The psychological mastery reached its absolute pinnacle when Harold's fleet sat hidden for 2 weeks outside Dublin harbour. 2 weeks! They let terror build as the city waited for an attack that came only when the defenders finally relaxed their guard. By the time the actual assault began, Dublin's forces were already defeated by their own fear and exhaustion. This was warfare conducted at a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern psychological operations. The Vikings had figured out how to weaponize uncertainty itself, turning the human imagination into their most effective ally. But as we'll see in our next chapter, even the most effective military innovations eventually face countermeasures. The phantom ships that had terrorized Europe for over a century were about to encounter enemies who had finally learned to think like Vikings. Between 870 and 950 after Christ, something unprecedented was happening across medieval Europe. The Viking phantom tactics we've been discussing weren't just changing individual battles, they were reshaping the entire economic and social structure of European civilization. Think about this for a moment. We're looking at roughly 80 years where an entire continent lived under the dirty shadow of enemies who could appear from nowhere, strike with devastating effectiveness, and vanish back into nothingness before any meaningful response could be organized. The psychological and economic impact of this sustained campaign of terror was absolutely staggering. A single phantom raid could extract more wealth than a conventional battle, involving hundreds of warriors and lasting for days. The Vikings had essentially figured out how to maximize profit while minimizing risk, creating what we might call the world's first systematic application of asymmetric warfare principles. But here's what really gets me about this period. The Vikings didn't just stumble into this economic model, they systematically developed and refined it with the same careful attention they gave to their concealment techniques. The shadow crews we discussed in the last chapter had evolved into something that was part military unit, part intelligence agency, and part commercial enterprise. These elite warriors developed intelligence networks that spanned the entire European coastline. They knew the schedules of merchant ships, the defensive capabilities of major ports, and the locations where wealthy monasteries stored their treasures. They had detailed maps showing not just coastal geography, but the psychological blind spots of their enemies, the places where local populations felt safest and were therefore most vulnerable to surprise attack. The sophistication of these intelligence operations would impress modern military analysts. Vikings maintained networks of informants who could tell them when a particular monastery had received new donations, when merchant vessels were traveling with especially valuable cargoes, or when political conflicts might leave certain areas temporarily undefended. And here's where the psychology gets really fascinating. Monasteries across Europe began paying protection money to ghosts. Let me repeat that. Major religious institutions, centers of 2-3 posaraments, learning and spiritual authority, were leaving gold and silver at specific coastal locations to buy safety from enemies they never saw but knew were constantly watching. Imagine being an abbot trying to explain to your monks why you're paying tribute to invisible heathens. You can't point to a specific threat, you can't negotiate with visible enemies, but you absolutely know that failure to pay could result in your entire community being destroyed by phantoms who might materialize from empty air at any moment. The feedback loop this created was devastating for European kingdoms. Every successful phantom raid funded improvements that made the next raid even more effective. Vikings invested their profits in technological innovations that enhanced concealment capabilities beyond anything the world had seen before. They developed new sail designs that reduced the visible silhouette of their vessels from a distance. Hull treatments eliminated the telltale sounds that might give away their position, no more creaking wood or splashing water to alert coastal sentries. Some crews experimented with primitive but effective smoke screens, using burning wet seaweed to create artificial fog banks that could conceal an entire fleet's movements. The most successful phantom captains accumulated enough wealth to field multiple specialized vessels. Instead of single ships conducting isolated raids, they created coordinated wolf packs that could strike several targets simultaneously, while maintaining perfect coordination through their silent communication systems. But the true masterpiece of this shadow economy was Harold Greycloak's legendary summer campaign of 920 after Christ. Harold didn't just perfect the art of strategic invisibility, he turned psychological warfare into a profit-generating machine that would have made modern corporate raiders weep with envy. His ghost fleet struck 3 separate kingdoms in succession. And here's the brilliant part: each attack funded the next one while simultaneously gathering intelligence for future operations. Harold wasn't just raiding, he was building a sustainable business model based on terror and invisibility. The innovation that really sets Harold apart was his use of decoy ships and false intelligence. He would make enemy kingdoms defend against attacks that never came, forcing them to exhaust their resources and treasury on preparations for phantom threats. While they were spending fortunes on coastal defenses against non-existent raids, Harold's real forces would strike completely different targets that had been left undefended. Think about the economic implications here. Harold was forcing entire kingdoms to waste their military budgets on defending against his reputation rather than his actual forces. He was literally monetizing fear itself, turning psychological pressure into economic advantage. The psychological mastery reached its absolute peak during Harold's famous siege that wasn't at Dublin. His fleet sat hidden for 2 weeks outside the harbour, visible just enough to confirm their presence but never revealing their true numbers or intentions. The city spent a fortune preparing for an assault that seemed imminent but never came. Food supplies were moved to defended locations. Militia was called up from surrounding areas. Trade ground to a halt, as merchants refused to risk entering a harbour that might become a battlefield at any moment. By the time Harold finally attacked, Dublin had already spent more on defensive preparations than his raiders actually stole during the assault itself. This wasn't just military genius. This was economic warfare conducted at a level of sophistication that wouldn't be seen again until the development of modern financial manipulation techniques. Harold had figured out how to make cities defeat themselves economically before he ever drew a sword. The success of these shadow economy techniques attracted brave imitators across Scandinavia. Phantom raiding became so profitable that it drew investment from traditional merchants and even some European nobles, who secretly funded Viking operations in exchange for shares of the profits. We start seeing evidence of joint ventures where Viking shadow crews would partner with local knowledge providers, coastal residents, who could identify the most profitable targets and the best times to strike them. Some of these partnerships were so sophisticated that they included detailed profit-sharing agreements and even primitive forms of insurance against failed raids. The technological arms race this economic success funded was absolutely remarkable. Vikings were investing in innovations that pushed the boundaries of what 9th and 10th century engineering could achieve. Ships were being built with modular camouflage systems that could be reconfigured based on specific coastal environments. Crews were training with equipment that allowed them to remain underwater for extended periods, essentially creating medieval combat divers. Some of the most successful Phantom operations began using what we might call early psychological operations, SES, spreading false rumors about their capabilities, deliberately leaving evidence of their presence in areas they had never actually visited, and even staging fake raids with empty ships to maintain their reputation, while their real forces operated elsewhere. The economic impact on European kingdoms was so severe that some regions began developing what amounted to phantom insurance systems. Communities would pool resources to hire their own intelligence networks, creating early warning systems specifically designed to detect Viking stealth operations before they could achieve tactical surprise. But perhaps the most telling indicator of how successful the shadow economy had become was the response of the Christian Church. Religious authorities began treating Viking raids not as random acts of violence, but as systematic economic warfare that required equally systematic theological and practical responses. New prayers were written specifically to counter invisible enemies. Monasteries developed sophisticated early warning networks that could alert multiple communities simultaneously. Some religious communities even began maintaining their own phantom defense forces, small, fast ships that could pursue raiders using the same stealth techniques the Vikings had pioneered. By 940 after Christ, the shadow economy had become so profitable and so sophisticated that it was generating wealth streams comparable to the official treasuries of major European kingdoms. Viking phantom operations weren't just successful raids anymore, they were functioning as an alternative economic system that operated completely outside traditional medieval commercial structures. But here's the thing about any successful innovation: your enemies adapt. The success of the shadow economy was creating pressures that would ultimately lead to its downfall. European kingdoms were learning to think like Vikings, developing countermeasures that targeted not just the tactics themselves, but the economic foundations that made phantom warfare profitable in the first place. The golden age of invisible dragon ships was about to face its greatest challenge yet: enemies who had finally figured out how to fight ghosts. Nothing lasts forever, and that includes military innovations, even ones as revolutionary as Viking phantom warfare. By 950 after Christ, the golden age of invisible dragon ships was beginning to face a harsh reality. Their enemies had finally learned to fight back. The European kingdoms that had suffered under phantom raids for nearly 2 centuries weren't just adapting, they were systematically dismantling the advantages that had made Viking stealth tactics so devastatingly effective. And they were doing it with a level of coordination and technological innovation that matched, and in some cases exceeded, what the Vikings themselves had achieved. Let me paint you a picture of what this counter-revolution looked like. Networks of watchtowers began appearing along every major coastline, connected by fire signal systems that could alert entire regions within hours of a potential threat. This wasn't just random defensive construction, TAs. This was systematic early warning infrastructure designed specifically to counter stealth operations. Think about the implications here. The Vikings had built their entire tactical advantage on achieving surprise through concealment. But if coastal defenders could spot potential threats while they were still far enough away to organize responses, the whole phantom warfare model began to collapse. The Byzantines, who had been dealing with various naval threats for centuries, shared their Greek fire technology with Western European kingdoms. This was absolutely crucial, because Greek fire was one of the few weapons that Vikings genuinely feared. You can't hide from a substance that burns on water and sticks to whatever it touches. Suddenly, Viking ships that managed to achieve surprise could still be destroyed by weapons that didn't require careful aim or perfect timing. But the most devastating countermeasure was also the most obvious. Specialized hunter ships with shallow drafts and crews trained in local coastal knowledge. European kingdoms began building vessels that could follow Vikings into the very marshes and inlets where they had previously been safe from pursuit. These hunter crews were recruited from local fishermen and coastal traders who knew every hidden channel, every seasonal current change, and every secret landing spot that Vikings might use. The shadow crews had relied on superior environmental knowledge, but now they were facing enemies who possessed the same advantages, plus intimate familiarity with their own home waters. The psychological warfare that had been so effective for the Vikings was turned against them. Coastal communities that had once lived in terror began setting elaborate traps, using false signals and decoy targets to lure phantom raiders into prepared killing zones. The hunters had become the hunted, but perhaps the most significant factor in the decline of phantom warfare was internal. The conversion of Scandinavian populations to Christianity was undermining the spiritual foundations that had made stealth tactics feel honorable and sacred to Viking warriors. Remember, we're dealing with a culture where concealment had been elevated to a spiritual art form. The rituals, the sacred ship construction, the belief that certain techniques could make vessels truly invisible to enemy eyes, all of this was deeply rooted in pagan religious traditions. Christian Vikings began feeling uncomfortable with what their new faith characterized as dishonorable tactics. The stealth techniques that their ancestors had considered sacred expressions of warrior skill were being reframed as cowardly deception, unworthy of true Christians. This spiritual crisis created practical problems that went far beyond simple morale issues. The elaborate training regimens that had produced shadow crews required absolute commitment to techniques that many Viking warriors now considered spiritually contaminated. You can't maintain elite special operations capabilities when your personnel are having theological doubts about their mission. Magnus Barefoot represented the last generation of true phantom raiders, and his career perfectly illustrates the challenges facing Viking stealth warfare in this new environment. Magnus was skilled in all the traditional concealment arts, but he was operating in a world where those arts were increasingly ineffective against sophisticated countermeasures. His desperate attempts to maintain the old tactics against the new defenses culminated in a series of failures around 1060 after Christ that demonstrated just how completely the strategic environment had changed. Coastal settlements had learned to think like Vikings, systematically blocking the hidden channels and secret landing spots that had been accumulated over centuries of successful operations. The Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066 after Christ proved definitively that the Viking Age had ended. Harold Godwinson's forces detected and destroyed a Viking army that previous generations could never have caught. The phantom ships that had once appeared from nowhere and vanished like mist were tracked, cornered, and annihilated by enemies who had finally learned to see through their concealment. But here's what I find absolutely fascinating about this transition. The legacy of Viking phantom warfare didn't just disappear. It was absorbed, adapted, and transformed by the very enemies who had defeated it. Medieval naval manuals began incorporating Viking concealment principles into standard tactical doctrine. The emphasis on intelligence gathering, psychological warfare, and environmental mastery became fundamental elements of European military thinking for centuries to come. The transformation of these techniques from terrifying reality into heroic mythology happened with remarkable speed. Within just a few generations, Europeans were celebrating the very enemies they had once feared with absolute terror. The phantom raiders, who had once extracted tribute from ghostly threats, became the heroes of romantic sagas and epic poems. Modern special forces still study Viking approaches to operating behind enemy lines and achieving strategic surprise. The principles of using environmental knowledge for tactical advantage, maintaining operational security through perfect discipline, and weaponizing psychological pressure remain relevant to military thinking today. When you read about Navy SEALs or special air service operations, you're seeing direct descendants of techniques pioneered by shadow crews in the fjords of Norway over 1,000 years ago. The technology has changed beyond recognition, but the fundamental concepts of stealth warfare were established by warriors who learned to make dragon ships vanish into empty air. And perhaps that's the most fitting legacy for the phantom raiders. Even today, when mist rolls across northern seas, sailors still speak of ghost longships lurking just beyond sight. It's become a cultural memory that transcends the historical reality, the idea that somewhere out there, invisible enemies might be watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The Vikings achieved something that very few military innovations manage. They created techniques so effective and so psychologically powerful that they outlived the civilization that invented them. The phantom ships may have faded from history, but the fear they inspired, the tactics they pioneered, and the legends they created continue to influence how we think about warfare, stealth, and the terrible possibilities that might emerge from empty horizons. In the end, the Vikings didn't just master the art of making ships disappear. They made themselves immortal by vanishing into the mist of legend, where phantom longships will sail forever through the collective imagination of anyone who has ever wondered what might be lurking just beyond the edge of sight. The dragons learned to vanish, and in vanishing, they became eternal.